Good evening, everybody. I am Lloyd Auerbach, Professor Paranormal, and welcome to another episode of Ask Professor Paranormal, where I answer your questions about, the paranormal, parapsychology, related stuff, even chocolate if you want to toss that one in there. Tonight, I do have a couple things. I've already seen a couple of questions that have come into the chat. I also had somebody send me something in advance. But I do want to start, and I'm going to finish, as usual, with just talking a little bit about the upcoming courses that are going to happen with the Rhine Education Center. That is, the link is in the about this channel. It's just simply Rhine, RHINE, edu.org. And this time around, I'm going to be teaching a course which is actually one of my favorite courses to teach, as it happens. And that course is called Presenting the Paranormal to the Public. And it's really about if you wanted to talk to regular people about the paranormal, or even to academics technically, but you want to talk to regular people about it, and you plan on lecturing, talking, giving a class yourself, if you want to write about it, if you want to learn to actually work with media a little bit better, the course is more of a practical approach to about our jargon and language and what you use with the general public and with other folks within and without the field. There's actually two fields here, by the way, or two groups. There's the parapsychologically educated people and people who read parapsychology, and then there's the whole ghost hunter world, which has a lot of other language and jargon that doesn't fit in very easily with the general public. Let's put it that way. The writing piece of it is based on a publishing class that I've taught in the past, as is the media part of the class, which is based on a media skills class that I've taught. And finally, I'll be talking about public speaking. I've been a public speaking coach and doing public speaking myself for decades. So I hope you might consider that course if you haven't taken it before. It is one of our certificate program courses as well. There's also a course called Introduction to Lucid Dreaming with Robert Wagner, who's a well-known expert on dreams. Another class is someone who's on the board of the Rhine Center, Sally Ann Drucker, a longtime parapsychologist, who's going to be teaching a class about writing about your own experiences and the best ways to do that, and maybe even publishing those. And then there's a course called The Power of Nature, the Folklore and Practices of Evoking the Divine with Chantal Toporoff. And finally, a course called Science Christianity with Jimmy Akin, who's well-versed in the history of religion and also has been teaching our Intro to Parapsychology classes. You can find the descriptions and syllabi via Rhine EDU, that's RHINE edu.org. So please take a look at those, and I hope to see some of you in one of my classes as well. Does your course Presenting the Paranormal to the Public also include how to handle people who think psi is evil? Yes. Not only that, how to handle skeptics, like, the total disbelievers, because there's believers in other areas also. So besides religious believers or disbelievers, or people who think it's evil or not, you also have true believers in the New Age context and even in the ghost hunting world. And it's really how to work with those folks, how to talk to them, because I've had a lot of experience doing that over the years. And hi, everybody who's saying hi right now. Okay, so anyway, I do hope that you take a look at that course. I will be turning that into a book also down the road. And if you take the course, or if you've taken the course, when the book comes out, I'll be giving those folks a significant discount on the book as well. So let me go to the questions. One of the questions that came in early on in this piece today is a question about my case that was written up in Surviving Death by Leslie Kean about Lois of Livermore. That's the name of the ghost and the location where that case is. One of my older cases that started in late 1984, early 1985, and it was my best case of a clear interactive apparition with really no other explanation, unless the kid who was the main communicator, all the family members saw this woman, but the kid who was the main communicator, unless he was incredibly psychic or something else. But there was so much evidence. So in the book, Surviving Death, I talk about the case, and then I followed up through about 2004, and I have lost track of the family since then. moved away. I'm not sure what happened with Lois. Until that time, I know that she was still in the house and still communicating with the mother because she was still there. She got divorced from her husband, and Chris, the boy, grew up and moved out. But he had visited the house and communicated with Lois after he moved out of the house and apparently got married. And from what I recall, his mom told me that his kids were seeing Lois also. So I don't know if Lois moved with the mother or not, or moved away. So unfortunately, I haven't really been in touch with them at all. All right, the question that came in early on, actually a couple of days ago, somebody wasn't going to be able to make it tonight. He wanted me to talk about a concept that has somehow shown up in the ghost hunting world, and I'm pretty sure it's because somebody rediscovered the term, and it's a cool term, and that is the term egregore. And an egregore, that's an old term that no one in and around parapsychology would even think of using because it has a lot of religious baggage with it. We use the term thought form. Egregore is a conscious, seemingly conscious entity that is created by the belief, concepts, thoughts of living people, and it becomes self-autonomous. That describes, actually, a tulpa in Tibetan tradition, and it describes what is generally called a thought form. That the idea that we can put enough thought and belief into it. In the Tibetan tradition, one person could put enough energy, thought, and belief so that this entity comes to life, more or less, and can interact on its own, can kind of exist after that. We have looked at thought forms in our field, and there's really no way to disprove thought forms. And there have been occasions where perhaps what's going on is actual thought form. In some respects, the non-autonomous, a non-conscious thought form would be a haunting, residual haunting. It's people, looks like people. It's a recording, not conscious, not interactive, kind of like a movie is not conscious, not interactive. The thought form would be, if there was enough push into that, does that seemingly human or other entity come to life or take on a life of its own? It is no more powerful. There has not been a single case of an ostensible thought form that is any more powerful or even active than a really active apparition of someone who used to be alive, so an apparition of the dead. But it's an interesting concept, certainly. And it's one that I've considered, in some of the cases, whether that was what was going on or not. There are some markers we have to look for something like that. And I think it's worth considering and also reading up on, but you're probably not going to, somebody wrote a book on egregores a couple of years ago. It's a thought form, right? If you say egregore, this is why I'm teaching this Presenting the Paranormal course. Because if you say egregore to anybody who's, even when it was mentioned to me last year, somebody says, do you know what an egregore is? And it's like, I vaguely remember that term, but if they had said, well, do you know what a thought form is? I would have known right away. So, or even a tulpa, because that's pretty well known for other reasons. So one of the things I talk about in the Presenting the Paranormal course is picking the right language to use, the right words to use, and explaining yourself and not assuming that people know what you're talking about. I don't even assume people know what I'm talking about when I say telepathy sometimes, depending on who my audience is. So let alone apparitions or hauntings or things like that. Really important to know your audience and know the language as well. Okay, other question that came in was about, I have not, I'm afraid I'm way behind. I'm watching New Thinking Aloud. It looks like it came from Spirit Mystery 777. Jeffrey Mishlove did a 4-part episode on Annika and Tristan, two souls in one body. My thoughts on two souls sharing. Well, I would use the word consciousness rather than soul, because soul has too many other implications to it. The question is, what are your thoughts about multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder, DID? Is that a second consciousness? when somebody switches personality completely, or is that part of the same person that takes on sort of its own part of that person's consciousness? And that's a question. I don't know, other than you want to talk about possession, whether it is through a trance medium, which technically is possession, that's kind of allowed or invited possession, versus forcible possession, which doesn't seem to happen that often. That's two spirits in two consciousnesses in the same body. The other person doesn't go away. So it's tough to kind of pin that down when we don't know what consciousness is. There was a show back in the 90s called The Extraordinary, and it was about extraordinary people. And not just psychic things. There were all sorts of other things covered. One of the episodes, I talked to them about a couple of cases years ago, and they sent me a copy of one of the shows, and I still have it. And in that show, there was a part of the episode was about a kid in England, he was a teenager, who very quickly could draw in a way that looked photorealistic. That's the only way he could draw. He could look at a landscape or a cityscape, a skyscape, skyline, or things, and he could draw quickly in a way that had perfectly straight lines. It just was incredible photorealistic. There was a woman in one of the other segments who had 65 different personalities, and she was being studied by people at Stanford University and other places. And what's really interesting about this woman is that one of the personalities had a physical change that could not be explained. She, the woman herself, was legally blind. She could barely see. But when she was in this other personality, apparently the shape of the eyeball changed, and she could actually see and read, which is, the ophthalmologist they had from Stanford was kind of baffled by the whole thing. But that's really interesting. Were there 65 different consciousnesses in this body, or was there something else going on? Hard to know. Okay, looks like Paul, you mentioned Liz Enton's book, WTF. Guess what that stands for? There's a second one coming out real soon. Yes, I have read her book. I know Liz really well. She does a lot of work for the Forever Family Foundation. I'll be seeing her in October again when she comes out to the Bay Area for our next grief retreat, which is mid-October. And I have read, I'm in her first book. And of course, she ran everything by me. She's also run stuff by me for the second book as well, the stuff that is our conversations. She was very, very skeptical. And I know that in a scenario she's going to talk about in the second book, and I think she might have talked about in the first one as well, where she did a reading. She was going to do some cold reading in one of our events, and she ended up getting some real information and blowing herself away. It just was really funny to watch, actually. Liz is a great person to work with, and I love her writing and stuff. Yeah. Okay. Glad you enjoyed her thought form. Tina, Nerds, isn't thought forms from Theosophy? That's where I think the word itself originated, but it's a much older concept than that. It exists in different descriptive terms back thousands of years in some instances. Certainly Tibetans, it goes back really far. And I'll tell you a little quick story here. I may have mentioned this before, but back in the 80s when channeling was really, really popular, people were channeling aliens, and they were channeling ancient Atlanteans, and they're channeling all sorts of beings and all sorts of stuff. One of my colleagues who was working with, we had an organization in Berkeley for many years called the California Society for Psychical Study. And John Klimo, who was also on faculty at Rosebridge Graduate School, which no longer exists, John Klimo was part of our organization, and he wrote the book on channeling. Highly recommend it. It's KLIMO, called Channeling. So I got a call from People Are Talking, I think it was, which is a local talk show on our CBS affiliate here in the Bay Area. And I had been on the show many times before, and they asked me to come on the show. They were doing a show on channeling. And John was going to be on the panel, and there were going to be several channelers on the panel. And they actually wanted me to be the more skeptical voice, or at least the more middle of the road voice for this. which was fine. I like to say that I was on with a panel of channels. So there were a couple different channelers. One was a woman who was channeling, among other beings, an Irish woman from the 17th century. Her name was Kathy Reardon, and Kathy worked with John and worked with me after the show, because she had been only a channel for a couple of years and spontaneously started channeling. And turned out she was really psychic, had a psychic opening. It came out as a channeled type entity, but she eventually lost those entities, realizing it was really kind of integrating all of it into her own consciousness in many respects. There was a guy from who was on faculty with me at JFK University, who was also, besides being a faculty member, was a channeler, and he was one of many people who channeled a group consciousness on the other side called Michael. You can read about the Michael entities. Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough, who was a fantasy writer, lived in Berkeley, was the first person to write about the Michael channelings. There was a woman who claimed to be a walk-in. So this may not be a concept you've heard, except maybe here, because I don't hear that talked about at all anymore. But a walk-in is a human being at the soul level, this is the way it's described to me, is not living his or her best life and really is depressed. And somehow there's a connection with a being on another planet, in an alien world. And that person, that entity in that world is also having problems. And they agree to switch bodies. So the woman is a walk-in, and the entity was supposedly an alien, an extraterrestrial, being from the Andromeda galaxy. That's 2 million light years away, folks. No indication that there was anything extraterrestrial in anything she said. Let's put it that way. And then so I was sitting there, and then the person to my left, who honestly got very little airtime or time to talk, which is really too bad, was a woman claiming to channel Athena. Okay, so during the commercial break, I turned to her and said, "So Athena, are you the Greek goddess?" And the response was, I thought, best thing I've ever heard from a channeler. No such thing as the Greek gods. I am a thought form that was created by the belief of the ancient Greeks that represents wisdom. That's what Athena represented, one of the things she represented. So basically, she was saying she was a thought form that was being channeled based on belief rather than an actual entity that ever lived in any way, shape, or form. That was kind of cool. So I did have a talk with the thought form in that way. Can't tell you that was actually a thought form or the unconscious mind of the woman herself, which we see with many channelers, but it was interesting, in the very least. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Little slowdown right now. Nerds, I knew a guy in San Francisco, he said it was a walk-in, and told me his experience of coming in. Yeah, we don't know what to make of walk-ins. I know a lot of people, it may be the unconscious's way of avoiding suicide because they hate their lives. It could just be a decision, conscious decision for that matter. It could be any number of things. And it could be some other entity for that matter. All right, the walk-in thing, this is the basic problem with channeling. So with mediumship, when you have a medium communicating with, or even someone coming through who is a deceased person, they provide, if it's an evidential medium, they provide information, factual information, but also emotional context and quite a bit of information to help you identify that person. The basic problem with channeling is that channeled entities come with no backup to their identity. So in other words, we can kind of get the ID of a deceased person coming through a medium. We can't even ask for ID, prove to me, don't even prove. Give me some evidence that you're actually an extraterrestrial coming through this person. Something, anything. I mean, I'm not expecting language because it's what we know about mediumship is sometimes based on what's in the head of the medium. But even speculating on technology, anything would be interesting. Talk about the environment you're from, anything, nothing, zip. Ramtha, the very famous Atlantean prince who came through Jay-Z Night, no information about Atlantis, geographical or otherwise. So no ID, we can't think anything other than perhaps they are parts of that person's personality in that sense. And a lot of channeled entities provide advice on stuff. Frankly, the advice that I heard from channeled entities, the modern version would be Dr. Phil, but it would have been Joyce Brothers back in the 80s, like a pop psychologist on TV. Nothing really evocative or exciting. Okay, my thoughts on apports. Apports are just simply objects that appear from nowhere, and there's some good evidence in certain cases that apports can actually happen. I do question the apports that often happen in physical mediumship because there's so little control on the environment, especially all the lights are out. So there's a question there. There have been studies of people who have been able to produce apports or produce things. And in situations with poltergeist cases where there's actual activity, physical activity, some of which is witnessed, there can be apports, or I should say even teleports. Things like that happen. So it seems like I always wonder where these things come from. Like, was it stolen from somebody? There's a case, one of my former students down in Mexico City. It's being studied by one of my colleagues down there. Guys in business. He's not a psychic or at all. And they've been having coins, not only of various denominations of Mexican vintage or mint, but from all over the world. Just simply drop into the house. It's a whole apport thing, and it's been going on for a few years. So pretty interesting stuff. Okay. Can the spirit of a deceased loved one who has been communicating regularly with family bring or let in other spirits? It's possible. They would have to, it depends on the communication that you're talking about, but it's possible they picked up, they got chummy with somebody else and asked them to come along. Experiencing interaction and images that are often weird and frightening. Well, if you've been communicating with the deceased loved one, have you asked what that's about? I mean, that's what I would do. Communication is the key, always. Are channeled entities different to you than spirits coming through mediums? Absolutely. Yep. Spirits coming through mediums, dead people. Again, mostly people you can confirm lived at some point, and generally relatively recently. It's pretty rare for a medium to channel someone from the 19th century or even the early 20th century. Somebody might have been born in the early 20th century, certainly, but nobody. I don't know mediums who actually talk to, like, have Abraham Lincoln coming through, or certainly anybody we'd recognize from history in that way. And if they are claiming that, I would be very concerned, and I would have to start asking a lot of questions to really determine if that's who's coming through. The same thing we'd have to do if somebody was claiming reincarnation of that person. So it's important to do that. Dave, in your experience with psychics mediums in the Bay Area, do you ever glean interesting impressions that point to the identity of the Zodiac Killer? No, not that anyone. I don't know if Annette Martin or Kathleen Ray, who both worked with police, ever were consulted on that case. I'm pretty sure Annette was not. Kay might have been. As it happens, I got a friend of mine who actually the police have interviewed multiple times over the years, going way back, because there was an indication he might have actually seen the guy who was the Zodiac Killer. He has been interviewed a number of times over the years. Not a psychic, though, at all. Paul, I recently watched Ed Kelly from DOPS. That's, for those who don't know, DOPS is the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia's Medical School, about their research. It bothers me when skeptics like Sue Blackmore says she studied the paranormal and found no evidence. Well, Sue Apsley was a researcher. Sue was a researcher and did a lot of work on out-of-body experience and stuff. I met her actually at a Parapsychological Association convention in 1981, as a matter of fact. And eventually she was not getting significant positive results. Everything was chance. She pretty much gave up and went to the skeptical side, went to the dark side, you might say. I did encounter her when I was shooting something for Japanese television on near-death experiences, and at that point her claim was the tunnel effect for NDEs was due to the de-escalation of oxygen in the brain, which was pretty clearly not the case physiologically or otherwise, for a lot of reasons. And certainly the one reason I cited was the fact that people in Japan and folks I talked to who are connected to the Chinese community here in San Francisco who had near-death experiences did not see a tunnel. It was a bridge, it was a stream or river, it was a flower garden, the whole bit. So different. There are, Chris French, who studied parapsychology. Richard Wiseman studied parapsychology and got their, they studied parapsychology at Edinburgh. Wiseman especially, big old pseudo-skeptic, disbelieving skeptic. Both of whom know quite a bit. And at least French has come out recently and admitted that parapsychology is a science, even if we're not interpreting things right. You refer anybody to the Skeptical podcast with Sue Blackmore, Alex Takaris. Yeah, he does a great job of grilling skeptics. Skeptico is a great podcast. It's not, it's a truly skeptical podcast. In other words, asking questions to get the information and evidence appropriately, and asking the right questions if somebody really is acting on belief rather than on evidence, on research, which is a big problem because we know that so many of the skeptics, so-called skeptics, actually don't read research. I don't know what Sue's, what her current habit is for reading research these days. I don't know if she's doing that. I don't know if she's been doing that for years. Richard Wiseman is fairly aware because his partner is Carolyn Watt, who is a parapsychologist. So he's aware. I'm sure those conversations are pretty interesting from time to time. And of course, there are people in our field in parapsychology who are more materialists, who don't even consider that there is a possibility that there is survival of bodily death because they're approaching everything from a pure materialist perspective. So, we have even differing opinions within the field, which is as it should be. We see that in almost every field, actually. Just look at psychology and the differing opinions that are there. So quite a bit that's different. All right. I will mention that if folks are interested in reincarnation, out-of-body experience, near-death experience, especially NDEs and reincarnation, the Division of Perceptual Studies has an enormous amount of information on their website about those. And of course, for reincarnation cases, children who remember previous lives, they've been the leader in that research and almost doing the majority of research since 1960 and continue to do that work as well. All right, we have a moment quiet here for a moment. So let me just make mention that if anybody is really interested in the science and you feel like going to Mexico at the end of August, the Parapsychological Association is having its annual convention in Mexico. And I think it's towards the end of August. So if you go to parapsych.org and look up the event, it'll have the conference will be listed. You can go if you want. You don't have to present a paper or anything like that. You can go pay. I'm not going to be going this year for a number of reasons, but kind of sorry I'm not going, but at the same time, I've been traveling too much lately anyway. So speaking of which, just as a reminder, that I will be skipping 3 weeks, and I'll mention this again at the end of this particular session. So the next session of this will be July 28th, because I'll be traveling for work. I'll be in Chicago, the Chicago area, actually, the weekend of the 20th and 21st for a conference for work. So we'll be skipping there. And then it'll be 2 weeks, again, every 2 weeks until we get to October. And then we're going to have to skip another 3 weeks after the first one in October. Okay, let me take a breath here and see if anybody has anything else that we can jump into. And if not, let me kind of go on and talk a little bit more about mediumship and channeling. So I mentioned earlier that Kathy Reardon had determined, after conversing with John Climo, with talking and working with me, that the personalities were actually part of her. And that, so what happened was she was in computer sales in the tech world. And she went to an intuition workshop with a woman named Betty Bethards. And she during the relaxation, or one of the session exercises, she started spontaneously channeling. Didn't know where that came from, had no idea. So, of course, she started doing that because it was clear that this was something happening to her, how her psychic abilities were coming out. We had a couple of interesting sessions with her for the California Society for Psychical Study. Kathy was a little tech savvy, so it's hard to know whether the advice we got about using certain technology and investigations came from Archon of the Pleiades, the alien, or from Kathy Reardon, speaking as Archon of the Pleiades. Her entity from the 17th century Ireland, from her Irish ancestry, no way to prove that person existed. Absolutely no way to prove that Archon of the Pleiades existed. But as John and I work with Kathy, she was taking on more and more responsibility for her own psychic perceptions, and the entities disappeared. So maybe they were there to help guide her into this new role as a psychic, but odds are what we found was that that these were ways for her to ease into, or it's ways for channelers to say things from the unconscious level that they could never say as themselves. Think of it as role-playing in that way. Yes, World Chocolate Day. That is correct. It is World Chocolate Day. I got an email about that from a couple of chocolate makers today. All right. In your experience, do psychics who pass ever make themselves known to other living psychics? That's an interesting question. So at our 2014 conference, we had the Forever Family Foundation did run not only grief retreats, but also conferences, which brought together some of the mediums, some scientists doing presentations on evidence for life after death, and so on. They were fairly well attended, in the hundreds, low hundreds, but still hundreds. And that we would have them in November, when we also would have our annual business meeting, the executive board meeting. And during the executive board meetings, when we had these conferences, we have our executive board, we have a medium advisory board, which are some of our certified mediums who kind of interact with the executive board and advise us on certain things. We have an auxiliary board, interestingly enough, it's composed of deceased relatives of many of the people who were the founders or on the executive board. And they communicate with the medium advisory board during our meetings to give us advice on perhaps some things we need to figure out for the following year, for what's coming up. So 3 mediums, and I believe it was Janet Mayer, Angelina Diana, and Laura Lynn Jackson. Could be wrong about which 3 that was, but I'm pretty sure it was those 3. They were connecting with the auxiliary board. And we were getting messages from people who were connected to the founders, Bob and Fran Ginsberg. There were some other folks as well. And at one point, one of the mediums says, wait a minute, somebody's pushing through, and she is not on the auxiliary board, which was frankly a no-no. It was very, very rude, but somebody pushed through. And when the first couple of words came out, the medium stops and says, Lloyd, this is Annette Martin speaking to you now. That's what was going on. So Annette Martin was a psychic and medium I worked with for many, many years. We co-authored a book, The Ghost Detective's Guide to Haunted San Francisco. We're working on another book. She was my investigations partner and a really, really good friend. So the weirdest thing was going on is that Annette is now speaking through these mediums. We're telling them what to say. And for a short period of time, one of the mediums would start a sentence. Next medium would have the middle of the sentence. The third medium would get the next part of the sentence. We call those cross correspondences. This was a very local one. And this was going on. It was just a really mind-blowing. And after this whole thing was over, and Annette was giving advice for the foundation. After this whole thing was over, all three of them said, I have never communicated with the deceased medium, or psychic for that matter. They said the feeling was different. The energy was different. It was different. And I then talked to another medium who spoke to Annette. Annette came through a few other mediums over time. And it was always very different. They said different energy, but a different sensation that they felt talking to her. I don't know about too many other psychics, dead psychics who've come through. I haven't read too much about that otherwise. But apparently they can if they want to. Hi, Sunshine. Have you heard about Eckhart Cruz experiments with physical mediums? That name looks familiar, but I'm not well versed. I don't, off the top of my head, I couldn't comment on that, unfortunately. And honestly, there have been various experimental groups working with physical mediums. We're trying to do their own form of that. And the real problem is just generally, especially knowing the history of spirit mediums, physical mediumship especially, and how it was influenced by theatrical mediums and by phony mediums and seances, and the developing stage magic world back in the 19th century. This whole thing in the keeping people in the dark because the spirits need the light hurts them is frankly BS. Mental mediums have no problem communicating with spirits in full light. The original physical mediums didn't need the darkness. And then if we consider that people see apparitions, ghosts, this whole thing of being in the dark in TV shows is contradictory to the experiences people have with ghosts where they're visually seeing the ghosts or otherwise. Those are, with rare exception, when the lights are on or during the daytime. So this whole idea that physical mediums are saying that they can't do their thing because the light hurts the spirits. If they said the spirits can't physically move things as easily in the dark, in the light as in the dark, I might consider that. But that's not what we're told. So that coupled with the fact that many physical mediums, even to modern ones, have been caught doing some fraud. Doesn't mean that all of it's fraudulent, but it makes us question all of that. So physical mediumship if they're not even going to allow night shot camera or some other form of infrared, and the one medium, I've actually know of several mediums who said, no, because it's going to hurt, the infrared hurts the spirits as well, when in fact, many of those mediums will use a red light bulb for part of their seance. And that light bulb gives off more infrared light than, even though we can't see it, it gives off more infrared light than the night shot camera spotlight does. So if it's fine for that red light, it should be no problem in the night shot camera, except of course that means that you can see in the dark. So anyway, let's see here. The skull experiment is a really interesting thing. The skull group did, that was not a mediumship thing. They didn't have mediums per se. They were using some of the techniques that physical mediums use to try to get some physical activity going, but also to get messages. And I believe Thomas Edison was one of the spirits that ostensibly came through. Supposedly, it was a group of scientists on the other side who were trying to connect with the scientists who were doing the research on this. The book is really interesting. There's actually a couple of books on the skull experiment, and there are a couple of videos, documentaries out there as well. It's pretty interesting stuff. The question, though, sometimes is whether or not the researchers themselves cause those physical things. That's the biggest problem with physical mediumship. Physical mediumship doesn't prove the existence of spirits, or it doesn't even support the existence of spirits necessarily, because in many of those seances, only one spirit is coming through the medium, and then stuff is moving around. And I know, do we have enough evidence that that one spirit was the person they say they were? I know in the session that I went to, there was nothing said by the control spirit, Hans Bender, the deceased parapsychologist, which would indicate it was Hans Bender at all. Nothing that came up. If the medium can bring through other spirits and provide evidence like regular mediums can, that's a different story, but we haven't heard too much about that. And if anybody's curious about this whole evolution that happened, first of all, I don't know if you read up on spirit mediumship, on physical mediumship, you'll read that many of the mediums have what's called spirit cabinet, which is not really a cabinet. It's often just a cloth circle like a shower curtain, which they enclose themselves in the dark, which is kind of ridiculous because it's already dark, but that's to kind of concentrate their energy. The development of the spirit box came from two performers in the 19th century, magician performers, the Davenport brothers. Look them up. That's where that comes from. Fake mediums, and then eventually real mediums who thought, oh, this is what people think this stuff is, started using the spirit cabinet in one way, shape, or form as well. But look at the Davenport brothers, just like it sounds. They were the first to use a spirit cabinet, and it was not spiritual at all. Let's put it that way. So that's only a piece of all this. There's so much more that has become folklore for people doing physical mediumship. Some of it's from pop culture. Spirits don't need to manifest. Spirits don't need to draw heat energy out of the room. That doesn't even happen really normally in poltergeist cases where there is physical activity. So, and the darkness that ghost hunting shows do is a combination of folklore from physical mediumship, because you can do a lot more fraud in the dark, and the availability of night shot cameras commercially to TV producers to make things look spooky. That is the only reason the lights are out, literally, for those TV shows, and therefore for everybody else. Is poltergeist activity or sounds or objects move always psiability from a living person? If we're going to class it as a poltergeist case, yes, but there are apparition cases where the apparition has somehow learned, like sometimes living people can somehow learn to move objects. It's rarely chaotic like you see in poltergeist cases. It's pretty clearly connected to apparitional sightings or experiences, whereas in poltergeist cases, you almost never have apparitions around, or not even any indication of any spirits at all, including from psychics and mediums, by the way. So we would not call it poltergeist activity. If a spirit's doing it, that is apparitional PK. That's something the apparition can do. Whereas poltergeist is all about the physical activity in general. All right. The website I tried to post shows the medium's cabinet spinning and lifting. Definitely seems like magic. Yeah, love to see that. It's pretty interesting. You know, magicians have done a lot with the idea of the spirit cabinet. If you also put into YouTube Frances Willard, Frances with an ES, and Spirit Cabinet. Frances Willard, daughter of a famous magician, Willard the Wizard, did the Spirit Cabinet act, and I'd seen it live 3 times, maybe 4 times over the years. Incredible, absolutely incredible act. Got to be seen to be believed that it even happened in many respects. All right, Dave, has unexpected spontaneous channeling ever been documented in a Gonsfeld session? Not that I know of. I've not heard of anyone doing Gonsfeld. That's mild sensory deprivation. For those of you that don't know, they're in a relaxed state, but I've never heard of someone going into a channeling situation in that way. But I will give an example of a really unique form of channeling, which is really maybe seems to be mediumship. Janet Mayer, who I mentioned a little while ago, one of the first mediums connected at all to the Forever Family Foundation. Sweetheart, absolute sweetheart, just one of the nicest people I know. Janet, during one of her sessions years ago, just spontaneously speaking what sounded like gibberish. And so she went into an altered state, not intentionally. The stuff starts coming out, and then it stops, and people are freaking out, like, what the hell was that? You know, in certain context, religious contexts, it would be called speaking in tongues or glossolalia. But it happened multiple times. And so Janet she was determined to find out whether this was actually a language. So she had cassettes, she recorded some of the sessions, had cassettes made, just duped, and sent them to the linguistics departments or linguistic anthropologists at various universities around the US. Nobody recognized it until someone at a university outside of DC wrote back to her and said, I may be the only person in the United States who can even recognize this, and I can't fully translate it. This is the language of the Yanomami. The Yanomami are a relatively Stone Age, still, tribe in the Amazon jungle. They're ones that's been studied by anthropologists, been contacted by anthropologists for decades, but it was their dialect. It was their language. And eventually he was able to get it translated by someone who actually knew Yanomami, because he would go down to the Amazon as well. And it was a clear message, apparently from a deceased shaman, a magic worker in the Yanomami, kind of warning us about what we're doing to the planet. Okay, so that's kind of a generic message, but still pretty interesting. It was in that language because no one in the United States probably knew that language. Certainly not Janet. All right. One of the interesting things was that this anthropologist also played a tape of what Janet was saying for some of the Yanomami men. And the thing is that the Yanomami had slightly different dialects for the men and the women. And the men were very, very upset that a female voice is speaking in the male dialect until they really kind of got the gist of what the message was, because it was a male spirit that was supposed to be speaking through. Since that time, Janet has occasionally had other shaman from South America and other tribes speaking through her with very different language or dialects, again, identified by some anthropologists. Totally spontaneous, although Janet can, at least for the last couple of years, can kind of bring it on, kind of connect with whatever is producing this sort of thing. She still can't translate it herself. She started learning to get the gist of what was being said, but that's about it. That's about the weirdest thing. So now, that kind of situation where someone who could not possibly have known a language can speak at all in that language, can, for quite some time, for several minutes, kind of a little literal speech with no contact to anyone, given the fact there almost is no one in the United States, and she didn't travel out to South America herself. There's only two possibilities from a paranormal perspective. One is reincarnation, which she was clear, said, no, it's not reincarnation, communicating with spirits. And the other, she's communicating with spirits. I don't know, we don't hear from the skeptics on this particular case. It hasn't gotten a lot of press. And she's been working on trying to get money up for a documentary. She went down to the Amazon and meet with the Yanomami there's an anthropologist. The guy she was working with originally passed away. Someone else she's working with now. It would be great if she could do that. But just this very odd situation, you would think that you could get a lot of really interesting people in the sciences looking at this. Where's she getting it from? It, certainly doesn't have any genetic memory of being, connected to the Yanomami, that's for sure. So anyway, just thought I'd toss that in there as a really interesting element of channeling, which borders on mediumship in this case. Still can't prove that it was a dead Amazonian shaman, because we have no way of identifying that person since he's been dead apparently for quite some time. And they don't keep good records. All right, we've got about 8 or 9 minutes left. Anyone have anything else they want to add or ask? And if not, while we're waiting, I'll just mention again my class, 4-week class. So the classes we're doing this summer for the Ryan Education Center are all 4 weeks. And they're kind of fun classes. A couple of them do actually connect with some of our certificate programs. My class, you can either take it just for fun. If you take it for a grade, so it goes towards a certificate, it's credit, no credit. I don't even give a grade specifically out on that class. There are a couple of minor assignments, but that class, Presenting the Paranormal to the Public, is really a practical class. Even if you don't want to talk to people about the paranormal, you'll get something out of the public speaking piece of it, the writing piece of it, the media piece of it, all of that. Yes, Jody, that is correct. Not every day you get to meet a dead Amazonian shaman. Not any day, I would say, probably for most of us. All right, so back to my class. Take a look at the syllabus. It's Rhine EDU, so RHINE edu.org. The link is actually in the About This channel, so you can find all that information as well. And then there are other classes. The one I really do recommend, if you're interested in lucid dreaming, I do recommend that class. Robert Wagner has written a lot of stuff. It's really, really knowledgeable about lucid dreaming. He's written books on dreams and the subject. And then you might consider, if you're interested in approaching parapsychology or approaching psychic phenomena, the paranormal at all from the Christian perspective, you might consider taking Jimmy's class, Psi and Christianity. And then if you're interested in journaling and writing up your own experiences, if you're having a lot, then Sally Ann Drucker's class is good too. Would be very good for you. Okay, thank you, Paul. The next class on survival, next time I offer this, will be next spring. We just finished the class this time around. Technically, when I talk about apparitions in some of my cases, that also, of course, covers survival in other ways, in different ways. Just a reminder that my second edition of A Paranormal Casebook, slight changes to it, kind of updated a few things, that is available on Amazon as a paperback and Kindle book. If anybody really wants a hardcover, I could add that possibility too, but so far nobody's asked. So, but that book's available. I should have my Mind Over Matter book back in print by September. That's my goal. After I get past this next work trip, I'll start working on that. And then the Presenting the Paranormal to audiobook. Yeah, I was just talking to somebody about that. I have to get the right setup because I feel like I need to read the book myself. So I'm either going to work with somebody or I'll see about that. But hey, if you folks are nice and you want to send me an email, a number of years ago, I did a 2 CD set of ghost stories, some of my cases. Worked with an audio producer. And if you're nice and send me an email, just asking for that. I'm not asking for your email for a list, but you have to request it individually. I might be willing to give you a download link for those stories. Those are all audio. They're well produced. My email is simply askprofparanormal@gmail.com or profparanormal@gmail.com. All right. So anybody who's watching this, if you made it all the way through this episode, you can send me an email, ask for that as well. Mary Prankster just bought a magnetic field detector. Hasn't arrived yet, but any recommendations? I mean, just remember that most of them are set to pick up magnetic radiation from technology, electricity. So your outlets will probably show up. If you're anywhere near a circuit board in a house, big pulses of energy there. If you happen to be near your refrigerator, when the motor cycles on, that gives off a lot of EMF. Microwaves give off EMF. Most devices, by the way, will have settings so you can check to make sure your microwave's not leaking. Anybody still have a VCR around? Those give off a lot of EMF. Computers don't do as much as they used to. So just first thing I would say to do is walk around your own house and see what it picks up. Get near all sorts of devices, outlets, everything you can, because when you go out and use it in a place, you need to be aware that normal things set those devices off in unusual ways. My first time using one, I was in a house that actually had residual haunting, and I was down the hall as the folks who were with me were in the kitchen talking to the owners, or the renters, I should say. It was a rent house. And I hear a click in the distance, and there's a huge spike for a moment on my EMF meter. They turned the coffee maker on. I was 40 feet away. All right, now, that's why you got to check these things. All right, so that's my recommendation. All right, vacuum cleaners, yes, they give off a ton of EMF. A lot of stuff gives off EMF, much more than you think of. When I first started using one back in the 80s, I had a radio alarm clock with, liquid crystal, the red thing, red lettering. That gave off a huge amount. In fact, I moved it away from my head for that reason, because it gave off so much EMF. Cell phones give off EMF. Unless you eliminate the normal, you don't know that you're really getting an anomaly that you need to connect to somebody's experience, by the way. Just the reading on an EMF meter means 0, unless it's connected, unless you get rid of all the possibilities and you connect it to somebody's experience. That's called correlation. That's all important. Okay. As a reminder, as we kind of come down to the last 2 minutes, the next session of Ask Professor Paranormal is on Sunday, July 28th. We're skipping 3 weeks this time around. Please tell your friends. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you have not already done that. And come with questions or send me questions in advance. Those same emails I mentioned, and in the description of the channel, you'll see askprofparanormal@gmail.com as the email. You can also, like I said, send it to profparanormal@gmail.com if you wanted. There it is right there in the chat. You'll see the email. Just send me that if you're interested if you want the audio downloads, happy to provide them to you. It's the closest thing you'll get to an audiobook for the time being. All right. Otherwise, you can listen to the audiobooks of the novels, the mystery novels that I co-authored, Near Death. The other one's called Afterlife. Rich Hozek, who's the main author of the books, of our book series, did the audio for those, did the reading for that. And he also has his own audio podcast as well, with some really cool stories. So please feel free to, look them up. They're on Audible, of course. But otherwise, let me know if you want the downloads. And with that said, we are coming down to the half hour. Thank you, everybody, for attending, for coming this time around. Thanks for support. Do spread the word, Facebook or other social media, if you enjoy this kind of thing. And just remember that all the previous sessions have been recorded. So if you're just joining me today or last time, you can go back and listen to some other ones. And of course, you'll see a lot of the same questions might have been brought up in some places. All right, everybody, I want to wish you all a great rest of July until I see you next on the 28th. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.